My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. And we are finishing up today our reading group on Hannah Arendt's On Revolution. As we've said, this is her last published book. And in many ways, I think it is the book that most fully distills Hannah Arendt's political thinking, more than any other of her books. So we have traced that through the first 5 chapters. Chapters 4 and 5, as we talked about, are very much central to her understanding of the successful founding of freedom in the United States after the American Revolution. And as we've discussed, there were 2 parts of that. On the one hand, the Constitution of Liberty, the Constitutio Libertatis, which is the constitution of multiple sources and spaces for the exercise of power, such that no one power would overawe the others, and that also, to some degree, allowed for institutions for citizens to engage in public spirited action. And then, so first, to found freedom, you need to found power. And the other is you need to found authority. And that's the much more difficult one. And as we discussed in our session on chapter 5, she really suggests that the Supreme Court and the interpretation that the Supreme Court offers of the Constitution becomes the seat of American authority. So this is, up till then, a fairly positive history. And obviously, given the great exception she makes in chapter 4 about slavery, how slavery was the primordial sin, and that the founders ignored the invisibility of the mass of suffering slaves, one could say that there's an potentially overly optimistic take on the American Revolution up through chapter 5. Chapter 6 should, to some degree, allay those worries from its very title, which is the lost spirit of the American Revolution. She's the lost treasure. The revolutionary tradition and its lost treasure. She is making it very clear that she thinks the revolution here in the United States, in the end, has failed to found freedom. And so let's walk through it briefly. First, the first chapter is very much a setup from continuing from the last chapter. After talking about the Supreme Court as a foundational institution for authority, here she talks about the Senate. And the Senate is important not as an institution of authority, but as an institution in which people could express their opinion. And it was an important anti-democratic institution for Arendt and for the founders, and it provided a kind of stability in which multiple opinions could be heard from different parts of the country that would not be overawed by one opinion that could shut them up. And that was why the Senate was so important for her. It was the permanent body that could check the imprudence of democracy. And thus it offered a kind of stability, just like the Supreme Court offered a different kind of stability. And so you have these 2 conservative institutions, the Supreme Court and the Senate. And she says that these 2 institutions were deeply important for the American experiment. But, and now she moves to section 2 of this chapter, but there was no other institution that was set up as a lasting institution that would be a place that would preserve the other need for the founding of freedom. Not only do you need stability but you also need the opportunity for people to create, to found, to make something new. And it was this spirit of the new, which in many ways was what she calls the treasure of the revolution, of the revolutionary tradition. And she cites this quotation from René Char that our heritage was left to us by no testament. The idea is that our heritage, freedom, is not given to us by any testament. We have to take it. We have to find it. We have to act for it. And much of what the revolutionaries found, what they learned, what they experienced in the carrying out of the revolution was the experience of freedom. And the problem is that if your goal in a revolution is to found freedom, is to found, therefore, permanent and stable institutions that will secure the freedom that you found, that seems paradoxically and at odds with the idea that part of the treasure of the revolution is the spirit of creating something new, of overturning and rebuilding. And so how do you reconcile these two competing needs? And she turns to Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson had said famously that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. This is a kind of claim for what we might today call permanent revolution, that a revolution can never succeed without allowing for other revolutions to happen. And that's one argument that many people make, that revolutions have to be constant, they have to be permanent. Part of the payoff or the benefit, the treasure of the revolution is the experience of founding something anew. And how do you can't possibly institutionalize that. And we've talked a little bit in the last few sessions about Arendt's desire to create stable and lasting institutions for freedom, and how many contemporary theorists have sort of given up, and Rancière and Graeber amongst others. And so the question she then asks is there a way to institutionalize this idea? And she frames it on page 224, where she writes, quote, "But in this republic, as it presently turned out, there was no space reserved, no room left for the existence of precisely those qualities which had been instrumental in building it. Namely, there was no space for freedom in the Constitution." And this is really the beginning of her criticism. The Constitution, so many good things she thinks came out of it. It was worshipped. It was the seat of authority. But the Constitution, it created the Senate, which was a stable seat for public opinion, and it created for discourse around opinion, and it created the Supreme Court, which was a stable source of authority, but it didn't create an institution which would be a stable and enduring source for this treasure, this beginning of new things. And this brings her to the idea of revolutionary councils. And this is really the great insight of this last chapter, and what we'll spend most of our time, I imagine, today talking about. Building on Jefferson's insight that he expresses in a letter, she calls it his most cherished idea, which is that for Jefferson, we must divide the counties into wards. Basically, we must create small, he thinks around 2,000 citizens per ward, ward-centered discussion, debating, governing societies. And I'm leaving it very open as to what these councils do, because she, and also Jefferson, says we shouldn't say what they should do. We should be open to them figuring out what they're going to do themselves. They are bodies that will meet and talk and figure out how to act. And we should keep that as open as it's possible. And these ward systems are for Jefferson the key to the foundation of a stable institution of revolutionary treasure, of revolutionary freedom. And then in section 4, she's going to tie that to the actual history of these revolutionary councils as they've emerged in revolutions in Hungary, in Paris, and in Russia, and argue that this is something that all revolutions begin, but they fail. And they fail for a whole lot of reasons, but primarily because they try to administer government instead of simply govern. And we'll talk about what that distinction means, I'm sure, in the Q&A. And thus, she leaves us with this possibility of, could we create a revolution that founded freedom and that founded stable councils, wards, however you want to call it, that would allow freedom to continue to exist. And that really is how she ends the book. She thinks the United States did not do that, and as a result, it's in danger of becoming corrupted, by which she means that the people will, not having a place where they can exercise power, will increasingly pull back from the public realm and occupy themselves more and more with the private realm, seek to pursue their private interests, and to the extent that they engage in politics, it will be merely to buy off the politicians in order to pursue private interests, and that this will lead to the corrupting of American democracy and republicanism. So that's her pessimistic idea, and the optimistic idea is that these councils can work, and that these councils can offer a model for lasting and durable free institutions. All right, I will stop there and see what you guys have to say. We've now read this whole book. I hope it's a time for you to ask questions about this chapter, but about the book as a whole. The first question is from Bob. Bob asks, is Arendt's championing of councils and LETA, or advisory boards, a utopian vision or a practical suggestion? If the latter, does she concede that the councils cannot but fail to make the transition to governing? Are they bound to be shooting stars with a very short life? In Cuba, they still talk about the revolution as if there's an eternal flame, and in Hebrew, the ner tamid. Okay, it's a good question, and let me say that there's no, I don't know per se Arendt's answer, except to say this. She thinks that every revolution is accompanied by these councils. She thinks that they fail for a very specific reason, that they seek to do what they're not qualified to do. Namely, and this takes a little parsing, but what are the councils? The wards, the councils, they're a bunch of people who get together and talk. What do they talk about? The weather? Not really. They may talk a little bit about the weather, but what they talk about is what they want. We want a democracy, maybe, or we want a monarchy, or we want to tax the rich, or we want to tax the poor, or what we want to create is a system of benefits, and we want to create policemen to keep order, and fire stations and roads. And we talk about what it is we want and we need. And in such a activity of talking, some people prove themselves to be really good at not only talking, but persuading others and helping a group of people who disagree to come to consensus, or if not consensus, at least a compromise. And so these people who are gifted in the act of public discourse become sort of leaders of these groups. And then maybe, because there are only 2,000 people in each group, they'll get together with leaders of another few groups in the neighborhood or in the county, and they'll get together, and then the people who are really good at finding compromise amongst all those groups will then rise up, and they'll get together with the people in the state, and they'll come up with some plans. And she calls this a pyramid structure, right? So that you have this big pyramid of people who are in the ward, a few emerge, then they combine with others, they come up, they emerge, and you keep making a higher pyramid. And what she says is the people who are good at this, at causing compromise or promoting compromise and consensus, are not always the people who are good at implementing the plans. You know, we may say, we've agreed that we want to spend a certain amount of money on police, but that doesn't mean we're also the people who are good at hiring the police, running the police, and overseeing the police. And so the problem, the danger is that these same people will think, oh, well, we want to govern, we want to administer, and we're going to do that as well. And the problem is they're not very good at that. And this often leads to arguments and failures. And these councils are come to be seen as not efficient and as needing to be taken over by professional and technically trained politicians, and thus they lose their power. And so she does think that they fail for a reason, and whether this is utopian or not, she holds out the hope that some of these that we could create, if we created a constitutional space for such councils, they would provide a space where people would talk about this, and they wouldn't overstep it because it would be constitutionally set, and they wouldn't be done away with. They would be lasting. And so that's her idea. Is it utopian or is it practical? I mean, I think, Bob, I'm not the one to answer that. I mean, you guys have to decide whether you think it's utopian or practical. I mean, to me, it's an idea. People have to then try it out. And what she says is these councils have been tried out, but they've never been tried out in such a way that there was such constitutionally protected space for them. And now we have to sort of, understand what they're good for and what they're not.
Roger, in my state, Minnesota, this sort of exists, but at the party level. We have local caucuses, and then county, and then region, and then state. But it's party. It's a political party. Both parties, well, actually, maybe 3 or 4 parties do it. And over time, the attendance has fallen off. And maybe this is the corrupting that Arendt was speaking about. But the hardcore remains. And we see there's a hardcore for Trump, for example. So I think when it comes down to implementation, it has been implemented. And I wouldn't say it's failed entirely, but it hardly meets the hopes.
So there's a few things to say about that, which is that, one, as you said, these are party-based. And for her, one of the key aspects of these councils is that they're not party-based. They're not about, I mean, I don't know what the caucuses in Minnesota do aside from nominating party members and politicians and maybe writing a party platform. Is there anything else they do?
Well, that's basically it. There's a little discussion. In my area, it starts at the township, and sometimes I'm the only one from the township there. So I'm not going to talk to myself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of what she's saying here is a few things. One is they're not supposed to be party-based, and that's for a few reasons. One is because you actually want to talk with people you disagree with. Two, they're actually parties choose people not based on their ability to compromise and make consensus amongst people who disagree, but they largely choose people who, in her view, and I think not wrongly, are yes people, are people who have the interest of the party at heart, and not the interest of the republic at heart. And so she thinks that by focusing it on parties, you will lose the essential public spiritedness of it, and you'll choose people who, basically as the leaders, who basically do what's good for the party and obey the party leaders. Finally, what she really does hold open for these councils, as opposed to these caucuses you're describing, is that what they are for is open. She says, we don't want to say what they're for. Maybe they're just discussions, but they could also they could take on roles of governing or advising or of other things. And she wants them to remain open in their role and let people figure out their role as they engage in them. That's obviously a somewhat amorphous and vague proposal that she's making. But I think it makes a lot of sense. What she's basically saying is these councils will be opportunities for people to get together, and maybe they will just talk, but maybe they'll do more. And maybe they'll demand certain things from the state or the county. And if the county and the state don't do it, they'll organize resistances. I think that's what she has in mind. She doesn't say that particularly, but I think I think she sees these as organs of power. And the important thing is that they're organs of power in which all people have an opportunity to experience and attend them and participate in them, not just the representatives. And you're right. I mean, I think the caucuses have largely been somewhat of a failure. I don't know if that's the right term. I don't know if you would use that term, but they're not well attended, just like most town meetings in New England are no longer well attended. But a large part of that is because the power has been taken away from these institutions. There's very little power that a town has anymore. And that's partly because if you want to hire a policeman in New England, you have to also get money from the state because you don't tax yourselves enough. And thus the state has a say in who you're going to hire and how you're going to hire. And that takes away the sense of power, and thus there's not that much at stake in these town meetings. And so I think we have to these institutions have to have the capacity to be powerful if we want people to give up their time to participate in them. Can we do that?
I'm sorry, Roger?
No, go ahead, Howard.
I think one of the things that's missing from this conversation is the impact of economics, particularly today, where the wealth of the country, of particular people in the country, controls the media, controls the message, where techniques of marketing and communication are so powerful that the subject matter of the conversation itself, even if you were to bring these people together, is kind of predetermined by the interest of the money factor in the society.
Yeah, I hear that, Howard. I'm not as convinced as you are that money sets the agenda. I mean, if anything, what we've seen over the last 10 years in remarkable fashion is the way that a very out of favor and not elite group of people, especially on the right, have created an entire media network of websites and and other shows that have really radically altered the discourse in the country. Now, we could add that Fox News was part of that, and that was very well funded. So I don't want to dispute. I don't want to say money doesn't matter, but God, the vast majority of money in the media is on the other side of that issue. At least that's how I understand it. Maybe I'm wrong. Um, yeah, I think money matters. I think if you have a lot of money, you can hire good PR people and good producers to produce a message in a very convincing and an important way. But I don't think that's what this is really about, I guess. I mean, this is about whether if we created a constitutional space for people to have conversations and act on a local level, would they do so? And if you're going to say, well, they wouldn't, because they would all act the same way because the media is one national conglomerate that would make them all agree. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think, if anything, what we're seeing right now is the media splintering in many different ways.
I would tend to agree with Roger. That's a question of stakes. You know, there aren't stakes because the money comes from the state or the federal government. And so as long as we have, you know, this country of 300 million plus people and a federal budget of who knows how many billions, trillions, the stakes have been undermined. They've been taken away. And so I'm somewhat pessimistic, except for the fact that maybe somebody of my opinion, my inclination, would be able to use those means that Howard talks about, you know, to prevail.
Yeah, I know I've mentioned in the past a book by Arthur Vidich, and there's a second author, but I forget his name, called Small Town and Mass Society. And it's a book that I find to be one of the more important and under recognized books of the last 50 years. And they look at a small town in New York and do a very deep ethnographic study of it. And what they find is that these people in the small town think of themselves as different from mass society, as, you know, having small town values and being part of the New England town hall tradition and things like that. But and there's a lot of ways in which they poke holes in this fantasy, let's call it. But the one that's most interesting to me is that over and over again, people in the politics of the town, the people refuse to tax themselves, and therefore they have no money. And then anytime they want to do anything, build a school, well, they have to get money from the state or the federal government, and the result is they have to follow the rules of the state. And they have to, when they want to have a sewer system, they have to, again, follow the rules of the state. And the result, Vidich and his co-author argue, is that they actually have legal power to do a lot of things in this town. And they, over and over again, abandon that power, sell it in a way, in order to get money from higher up organizations, the city, the county, the state, or the federal government, and in doing so give up local control. And if you're going to continually give up local control in order to, in a sense, sell your freedom, sell your power for money, the stakes are always going to be pretty low in local government. And that, I think, is what's happened, which is why I think local government has largely been hollowed out. I mean, there are exceptions, I'm sure. And there are a lot of young people today, I think especially, and some not so young, like Bob, who are deeply engaged in trying to bring power back to local government. And to me, that's very much a hopeful sign. But what Arendt is saying here is that unless you have a constitutionally protected space for it, it will largely eventually disappear. All right. Susan writes, what does Arendt mean when she says society has perverted all virtues into social values? Okay, Susan, it might be helpful if I knew where you were pointing to when she said that. But all virtues. You know which virtues she has in mind here? Could be freedom.
I'm gonna look for it. I have to find it.
Okay. Maybe you could look for it and then let me know where it is. Okay. Suzanne writes, I understand why for Arendt the wards or councils need to stay out of the administration, the application of policy, but I assume if the discussions within the spaces of freedom are to have an effect in the broader society, they need to have some connection with those who govern and administer. Does Arendt address how the connection is to happen? So that's a good point, and the answer is she doesn't address it. She's not, to go back to Bob's question, it's not that she's offering here a practical formula, but I also don't think she's offering a pure utopia. What she says is they'll figure it out, or they have to figure it out. One of the constant critiques of Arendt over time has been, well, she says we should all be engaged in politics and public arguments, but we shouldn't argue about the social, the needs. We shouldn't argue about administration. So what else is there in politics? As if all of politics is about, well, how much should we pay people for welfare and how much should we pay the police? And let me say, that is politics. And she doesn't think we shouldn't have that argument. She thinks we should have an argument. How much should people get in welfare? What does it mean? What does it mean to have a dignified life? How much do you need? I think those are undoubtedly political questions for Arendt. What she doesn't think we should do is sit there and say, how should we create a system that administers it? She thinks other people, more expert, can do that. Obviously, if they do it and we think it's a bad system, we should have some say in it, and we should be able to make our suggestions. A lot of this is, to be honest, you have to sort of be willing to try and figure out what Arendt is saying here. She doesn't say a lot of this directly. There's a famous conference up in Toronto on her work late in her life, where she's asked this question, similar to the one Suzanne just asked. And she says, of course there should be some basic levels of sustenance and welfare, but that's really an administrative question. It's a question of, how to do it. And that's not a question that we have to so fully engage in politically. Where the lines are, I think, are blurred, and I don't think she's trying to say that there's a bright line. To some degree, we have to have these conversations, and then we have to, at some point, turn it over to people who are going to implement them.
Yeah, Roger.
Yeah,
I'm back with an economic argument. I think that it's exactly the direction of the conversation that is skewed or limited, I would rather say, by economic power. In your introduction today, you talked about public happiness, and what you're talking about now is the what or the why of politics, as opposed to the how do you do it aspect. But the focus is doesn't allow that kind of conversation. The reason why people don't tax themselves is because the economic message is accumulation, is hold on to your money and figure out a way to get more. It's not a discussion about, we produce things, we create wealth, and how, or not what, rather, how should we use it? Not in the terms of giving $10 for this cause or $10 for the other, but what are the kinds of causes, what are the kinds of social happiness that we should be dealing with the prosperity that we create. Instead, it just becomes a discussion about how do we hold on to what we have and get more.
I'm not sure I disagree with that. I guess the hope is that if we sit down and engage in these kind of conversations, we will find things that we want to do collectively and seek to do them. I think that's the hope.
Roger,
Yeah.
it seems to me the closest thing we get to councils now is if there's an issue involved. Gary mentioned his politics came through getting involved in offshore oil development and stuff like that. And when I had a little interest, for a few years I did work in politics, and the idea is when you get an issue, you get people flooding to run for office. When there's no issue, you have to spend a lot of time trying to get people to stand up and run for. I'm talking about local office now, towns, villages, and things like that. So when these ad hoc committees get together for some issue, a shopping center in a residential area or something, that affects them, then you'll get the councils, all right, and party doesn't enter at all, really. But the other thing about it, speaking to Howard's point, is getting angry about an issue usually involves property values. You're going to diminish my property value if you have a shopping center, or you know what I'm saying. But anyway, that's where when I was reading her about the councils, my head was saying, okay, I can get these people involved if something negative is going to happen in their neighborhood.
I think that's good. I mean, I think one of the things that one should ask is it important that when there aren't a lot of controversies, not so many people show up? Maybe not. I think her view is, you need to have these conversations. The framework should be there. There should be a space for it. And people should have that opportunity. But, not everyone's going to want to. And we shouldn't force it on them. I think what, Bob's experience, where he's the only one from his town, who shows up sometimes, that's a little depressing, and not surprising. But I think a lot of it is, as he was suggesting, the lack of stakes, that there just doesn't seem to be that much at issue on local government anymore. And to the extent that there are issues, they're just not ones where the local government has a lot of freedom. Because if you're not willing to pay for it, you just, in the end, don't have much power over how it's going to be done. And most local governments simply are not, they'd rather have the state or the county or the federal government provide the money and not have to put taxes on themselves. Is there a way to counteract that? That's an interesting question. It may be that that's just the way people want to be. They want to give up power to higher up institutions. But I think that as long as you keep these institutions functioning and you provide a constitutional mandate that they exist, this is her point, there's always that chance that they will provide an opportunity for freedom to exist, not simply. Remember what we're talking about here. We made these sort of dry distinctions between administration and governance. But what she's really talking about is the experience of starting something new. What she sees as these wards and councils can do is the excitement of factory workers saying, we want to start a new factory. We want to build something different. We want to create a new way of making this widget or whatever it is. I don't know. I don't think that there's a set for what is going to be done, but it's an opportunity for them to say, we want to take control over our lives and do something new, do something exciting. And in many ways, that's what these these sort of wards and councils are supposed to provide, is a space for that.
We had a city meeting once because we needed a new city hall and police office that was deteriorating. And a wonderful old hotel in town was donated. And the architect and the planner came up with a proposal for $325,000 to rehab this and have new offices. This was about 5 years ago. And a lot of people turned out for that meeting. Like Pat says, it's a question of affecting my property values or me personally. And there was spirited discussion. And this is a conservative kind of middle to lower income area. And the proposal won. And it won pretty substantially. So I guess, on occasion it does happen that people get together and they decide to spend the money.
I think that's right. And so having those institutions can be important. That's really what she's trying to talk about. Susan Tucker writes, isn't this exactly like New York City Council plus numerous administrative bureaucracies? Of course, City Council consists of elected borough representatives, not councils of 2,000, still left with bureaucratic problems. Yeah, I mean, I've worked for the New York City Council. No, I don't think it's like them at all. I mean, the City Council is an elected group of representatives. In fact, it's precisely not what Arendt is trying to talk about. She's trying to say what we need is a level where even people who aren't elected, who aren't representatives, everyone can participate and be engaged in some sort of public action of undefined goals. Yeah, and of course, most of the time, most people won't show up. But the space she wants to exist. So I think it's very different from the City Council, which is increasingly comprised of people who win high-priced campaigns and are very much parts of parties and parts of the New York party system. She really wants this to be outside of the parties. Harold writes, town meeting day in Vermont state holiday for more than 200 years. Town meeting day has been an important political event that sees local officers being elected and budgets being voted. It is a tradition dating back to before there was a Vermont. Right. The first town meeting was held in Bennington, Vermont in 1762, 15 years. In the late 1700s, people held meetings to address the problems and issues they faced collectively. Popular legislation matters in early town meetings included whether or not to let pigs run free or if smallpox vaccination should be allowed in the towns. Voters also decided what goods or labor could be used as payment for taxes. Like past town meetings, the meetings that occur on town meetings day in modern times serve a social function. All right. There's a book by a guy named, his last name is Bryan. It's Bryan on the New England town meeting. I forget his first name. But what he says, he does this very involved both statistical but also qualitative analysis of different town meetings in Vermont and New England over time and also more recently. And what he finds is more and more people aren't showing up at them as you might expect. But he also finds that it's some of them they do. And a large part of what determines it is the size of the town. Towns that are too big or too small don't usually get large percentages of people, but at a certain level, they do. And that's an interesting insight as to, Jefferson said 2,000 people. What's the right size? And one of the problems is that, our towns are not based on, the right size for a town hall meeting, which is why, as I understand Jefferson's proposal, it's not even a town council. There are these wards that are just 2,000 people, and they're not even based on town governments. They're really based on other things, which is a fascinating proposal. I'm not sure, Harold, if you had a question or just, presenting the this history, which is important. Kevin writes, on this issue of councils, it seems to me that someone, perhaps having read Tocqueville recently, might argue two things in response. First, that though the councils aren't built into the constitutional structure, this has never presented a proliferation of civil society groups in and through which Americans speak and act politically. And second, as already been suggested, that local government structures often provide an opportunity for some of the same kind of experiences as those provided by the councils. All true, Kevin. I think, first of all, we should say that the New England Council meeting is largely located in New England and hasn't really expanded too far out of that, despite what Bob is talking about in Minnesota with the caucuses. But the bigger issue is that these towns have to have, or these meetings have to have some power, some stake in them. And I think that's what is at issue. Now, you're right. They could be constitutionally mandated, and they could be there. And the people who come could say, we don't really want to spend any time on this, and we're going to give our rights and powers up to the counties and the state, and they could be largely useless. I don't think there's any way to ensure it. And so this may be part of an argument for, well, there's simply no way to create a revolution that can found stable institutions that will allow for freedom in this sense of the new experience of the new to be institutionalized. And yet, I think Pat and Bob and others have talked about, well, when issues emerge, these institutions, when they're there, can be reactivated. And I think maybe that's the point that I would focus on. In general, my reaction to the chapter is that her discussion of how the Constitution failed to secure the real treasure of the revolution was fascinating and profound and suggestive, but the discussion of the idea of the councils as a possible response or solution to that problem remains frustratingly vague. Suggestive for sure, but not much more than suggestive. I think that's fair. I mean, Arendt, throughout her life, is taken by this council idea. So in 1956, when the Hungarian Revolution happens and the Hungarian councils happen in Hungary, she gets very excited, and she writes this new epilogue to the book The Origins of Totalitarianism about these councils. And then afterwards, the councils sort of fall apart. There's also some anti-Semitism involved in Hungary in the Hungarian Revolution. We're not sure entirely why, but she takes that chapter out and never publishes it again in English. So, maybe she saw that she was too optimistic about the councils in Hungary. But then 7 years later, she publishes this book, and again, the question of the councils comes up. There's no doubt that this is on the more utopian end of her thinking. It's an attempt to say. I think it's an attempt to say, look, if we're going to have lasting institutions of freedom, we're going to have to include this experience of the new. And the councils always pop up. They are the organic, spontaneous ways that this experience of freedom emerges during all the revolutions. So is there a way to make that institution that is spontaneous somehow durable? And the answer may be no, right? But she's definitely exploring it. Susan writes, going back to the intro of On Revolution, footnote 3 suggests that conservative and reactionary movements and thinkers have always excelled at polemics. Conservative and reactionary have always excelled at polemics. because their ideas are derivative, having hardly produced a single idea or notion that was not primarily polemical. Unlike liberal or revolutionary thought, does this not explain the right's uncanny success at fashioning messages and policies that so perfectly match and symbolize their pernicious underlying principles? Oh, wow. That's a great question. I'd have to go back to, this is footnote 3 to the introduction you said. Oh, she's talking about the Mestre. Historically speaking, both conservative thought and reactionary movements derive not only their most telling points and their elan, but their very existence from the event of the French Revolution. They have remained derivative. Okay, so that's what you left out, Susan. Which they become critical of the French Revolution, right? And so what they always say is that revolutions lead to terror, and we should, I hope, all now be able to understand Arendt's response to that, which is that what kind of revolutions lead to terror? Social revolutions. Revolutions that seek to remedy the social question of necessity of the poor and the miserable, and thus have to A, take money from the other parts of society, and have to do it violently if they don't agree, and B, they have to, even though they're not the poor, have to present themselves as a friend of the poor, which leads to the problem of hypocrisy and unmasking, and leads them to, in a sense, be constantly open to the charge that they're not actually speaking for the poor, and they have to be sacrificed in the name of the revolution. So what she says is that since most revolutions come out of the French Revolution, the social question has largely dominated revolutions, and it has led to terror. And conservatives have largely rejected revolutions because they say revolutions lead to terror, like the French. I think that's her point. So you ask, Susan, if this doesn't explain the right's uncanny success at fashioning messages. Well, I mean, I think you have a boogeyman here. The boogeyman is the French Revolution. It's an easy boogeyman, and to the extent that they try and say all revolutions are like the French, they have an easy way of making their arguments. Okay. Harlan writes, I think the quote Susan meant is at the end of the chapter, 6 pages from the end. Political passions, courage, the pursuit of public happiness, a taste of public freedom, and ambition that strives for excellence regardless not only of social status and administrative office, but even of achievement and congratulation, are perhaps not as rare as we are inclined to think, living in a society which has perverted all virtues into social values. But they certainly are out of the ordinary under all circumstances. Okay, I imagine that is the quote Susan was talking about. It's beautiful quote. So what she's saying here is this is within the discussion of elitism at the very end of the chapter, and worth our mentioning. What she's basically saying is, and this goes back to the conversation we've been having, but there's never been a society in which most people want to get together and talk about this stuff. Most people want to sit at home and, well, if not watch TV, buy Bitcoin or whatever it is that they're buying these days. They want to take care of their family. They want to pursue their hobbies and their interests. Most people at all times generally privately centered, privately directed. And yet, political passions, the people who want to risk engaging in public, who want to pursue public happiness, who taste public freedom, are not so rare. There are people at all times like that. There should be more than one person at Bob's town hall meeting. right? There should be more than one person who wants to do that. But in our time, when we have perverted these virtues into social values, by which she means that a number of things, right? On the one hand, increasingly, the social sphere overtakes both the private and the public sphere. And that means that there's just not that much space for politics. What there really is a space for an argument about, how much people should have, and there's an attempt at what she would call coming up with a common public opinion, one public opinion, a social opinion, which is socially acceptable to have. And people are not going to make their arguments that deviate from that. They're not going to have the courage. They're not going to have the self confidence to deviate from social opinions, the opinion of the mass. And so we largely lose this public oriented values and virtues. And so in our time, it seems that only one person will show up to these meetings because the meetings are boring. People aren't going to really have meaningful debates. And thus it seems like no one would come, right? And she's saying, but actually more people will come if we can create a political culture where these kind of arguments are had and there's something at stake in them. That's her point here. Suzanne Ouellette writes, and if anyone wants to respond to that, I'm happy to do so. Suzanne Ouellette writes, thanks for bringing us back to the experiential level, to the experience of freedom, of starting something new. The absence of this takes a serious toll on all of us. It sure does. Just one example, the current drug crisis. Without experiences like those Arendt celebrates, we turn to artificial highs. That's a good point. I take that very seriously. There are many ways that we medicate ourselves in society when we feel trapped. One is drugs, another is music or video games, another is work. These are common ways that we all self-medicate. The overarching diagnosis Arendt calls here, she calls it lethargy to some degree, lethargy. In her essay on violence, she calls it Praxisentzug, the withdrawal of action, the feeling that increasingly we live in a world where there's no possibility of action. And so in all of these situations, there's the tendency and the temptation to simply be happy in private, self-medicate. So I think the drug crisis is one aspect of that. Kevin writes, I wonder if the Occupy movement doesn't come close to capturing the spirit of the councils, especially in terms of the General Assemblies and their participatory ethos, but a focus not on administration or party, but on fundamental reshaping of American politics. So this is it's a good point. It's one I've debated a lot with a lot of different people. There are ways in which the General Assemblies in Occupy could be seen this way. There are also ways in which they're not. They were obviously somewhat like-minded people engaged in these General Assemblies, whereas Arendt wants, no parties, 2,000 people. But more importantly, Arendt wants the wards and these councils to be governing in some way. She wants them to take a role. Now, this is very complicated. What role? She doesn't want them to administer, but she wants them to be arguing about, shall I dare to say, things that matter. And the problem with Occupy, at least as I have understood it, and Kevin, you can correct me if I'm understanding it wrong. I've talked to a lot of people about this and tried to figure this out, is that because Occupy was so clear in its statement that it wasn't going to have demands, it wasn't going to make demands, and that it occupied parks or public spaces like parks, what it didn't really get to was the hard questions of how we should actually be collectively governing ourselves. And that was what I felt was missing from the General Assemblies at Occupy. It was a lot of posturing. It was a lot of largely people who agreed with each other, talking about what they would like. But it wasn't a realistic claim to take on the difficult task of compromising in governing political entities. That was my experience of Occupy. I'm happy to have people tell me that they had a different experience or a different understanding. Bob has a question, but I see he's on the phone, so maybe I'll move on and come back to him. Melissa writes, here in Australia, we are a dualist state. So a lot of what is thrown around in the media regarding international law is null and void in relation to our nation's signatory on a number of United Nations treaties. But these debates can take a center stage. A similar direction is followed by state politicians who gain popularity via unfair constitutional proposals. Melissa, you might have to help me here. I'm not sure I understand what a dualist state here is in this context, and I'm not sure I understand the issue.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah, I didn't realize this for a long time, but they throw a lot of things around, like you can't have children imprisoned, because we're a signatory to the United Nations signatory. So we've got a bit of feedback. It's putting me off a little bit. And so therefore, things are thrown around that can't actually be legislated. So people become popular and get into politics, but they're not actually things that could be brought into the Senate and become legislation. And then quite often the states do the same thing. They spend, years hoeing and throwing over different laws, but they're invalid laws that can be struck down, or they'll just use wording that's just arbitrary and ambiguous. And so it's kind of not really, they put these people in now where we've got this, I don't know if you've heard, this dual citizenship issue, where if you wanted to stand and run in federal government, you could only be an Australian citizen. So you would denounce any dual citizenship. That would even be to your grandparents. So Australia being a very, very relatively young country of 200 years, you can see, that was quite clear that people knew that you had to denounce your citizenship to any other countries. But however, all these people have sneaked in, and they're sort of up and up the pay, where you had mayors didn't used to get paid, and even prime ministers, everything was very meager, and because everybody worked and had other businesses they run, and they vote their own pay up, and they don't turn up at Senate. So they've had this big marriage equality debate happening, and last Monday nobody turned up in the Senate. So things like this for the actual debate of the Senate bill. So you just wonder, how they get away with that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Australia's got a lot going on these days. including the immigration policies in Australia have caused a lot of controversy. I think the dual, from what I take it, you mean by dual dual state, is that they have an international obligations, and then there's national obligations. Is that what you mean by that then?
Yeah, we don't have to worry about the international ones at all, Professor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a toothless tiger.
Right. Well, I mean, that's one of Arendt's critique of international human rights in general, is that they are toothless tigers. Um, and it goes back to the discussion we had in chapter 4, where she says that, the only thing that checks power is power. Laws and constitutions in the end will not check a people who's set on doing something. And I think she's generally right about that. I don't think that means you don't create laws or constitutions or international human rights agreements. I think you do. But if you don't build popular support for them, they will in the end not protect people that they're designed to protect. And I think it's important for us to recognize that. And so I think one of the biggest mistakes that, for example, in people in human rights make is they focus all on the human rights law and the human rights regime, and they don't spend the time actually trying to convince people of the importance of these rules and human rights ideas. And the result is that these ideas are quite popular in the abstract, but quite unpopular when they have to be enforced against a particular state that's violating them. And that has caused all sorts of problems. So, Bob, I'm going to come back to your question. What do the non-Americans on the call think about the council idea? Traditionally, in most other countries, more top-down than settler countries such as the U.S. I don't know if anyone, Melissa, you just said something about Australia, but you didn't really mention the councils. Do some of the other non-Americans on here have views on this question of the councils?
Is it as in the county councils, as in local councils?
Well, yeah, or
Tribunals?
the councils, as Arendt is talking about them, the idea of creating a kind of
Tribunals?
constitutional space
Yes.
to have these kind of discussions and potentially governmental actions. Is that something that other countries have anything like that?
Yes, we do actually. We have like societies and yeah, a few things like that. Although they're becoming exceedingly less popular. Well, we have the student councils, of course. So they're, I suppose, with the university, they're, people are still quite keen and passionate, going for their positions with that. And you like see them going for candidates, and that's quite good. And some of those people do follow through into politics, which is always a little bit of a practice for them. So, and they get some of their policies in action, and you can see their personality. So that's quite good. So I suppose we have the student councils. That'd be the most sort of strongest ones. And then they have the cancer councils and the asthma councils. But now, again, they're another one where Hannah Arendt would say that they're sort of a structure that competes against itself and it doesn't really let anyone in.
Okay. Anyone
Yeah.
else? Anyone else have experiences with councils in other countries?
I could say something about Israel, but Bob's chat said other than settler countries, so that would disqualify any comment I made about Israel, really.
Okay, but are there equivalents at all of these kind of councils in Israel?
I think there are, but mostly my experience would be with, I'm getting the same stats, so it's driving me crazy. The experience I have would be with movements like Occupy, with protest groups who try to make a dent in the public conception of government, but we have been mostly shut up. No access to the media and distortions in the media and very little publicity. So I don't really know if it applies to the same type of activity that Hannah Arendt describes. a lot of protest groups in Israel are strong and with great ideology and great fervor, less access to the legal system, to the legislative process. So I don't know if it's the same concept.
Okay. Anyone else any other country experiences? Okay. Jan
Yes.
writes that, what would Arendt think of the EU? This is not a country, not even a federation of nation states. It's not, huh? And there is not a constitution. The Lisbon Treaty is presented as one, but it isn't. The EU Parliament is not real legislative power. Real power is in the hands of roughly 5 people who are not elected. This and have no accountability whatsoever. This is commonly called the Troika. During the Greek crisis, the Greek Minister of Finance was invited to this group, but nobody listened to him, which resulted in the. Are there any adults in the room? Well,
you have to go to my second part. Oh. This led to the creation of DiEM25.
Right, which is horizontally and vertically organized, and this has an opportunity to create presence at both local levels and in the parliament. This is a decision that has been taken only 2 weeks ago by all members of DiEM25, you mean, Jan? Yeah. But always without creating a new party, so the councils will act on an ad hoc basis, locally or nationally, depending on the subject, still only to support or influence local political organizations. To give an example, locally, we will delay 3 atomic energy plants, or shall we change definitely to green energy on the international level? DiEM25 could support in many ways Jake Carbon on Brexit or Britain back in. Yeah, I've heard a lot about DiEM25. I have to admit, done so much research on it. I don't know as much as I should. From what you're describing, it sounds like a fascinating organization. I think Hannah Arendt would think not much of the EU. It's about as non-democratic an organization as one could imagine. I think there's no surprise why you're having populist revolts around Europe. The EU is almost designed to make that necessary. I know we're having it in the U.S. too, so I think the United States has largely also become very anti-democratic and non-democratic in recent times. So, but I think less so than the EU in Europe. So what you're saying about DiEM25 is interesting. I don't know enough about it. Do you want to say a little more? I take it you're a member of it?
Well, anybody can become a member.
Uh-huh.
So it's totally democratic. What you have to do is to agree with the basic principles. There is a sort of manifesto, and if you agree, which is very, very large, if you can agree with that manifesto, you become a member. And the whole thing is starting up. There have been 3 important meetings where thousands of people met, and we're now starting. On the one hand, the first very big question that had to decide it democratically was, will we ever become a party or not? And the answer is no, we will not become a party. But that doesn't mean that we will not support some parties, or maybe even at some moments bring in people, try to bring in people into the European Parliament, just to push a number of things over there. That is the vertical structure. it is the vertical structure, and at the top you have 8 people. They change every 4 years. The first change has been made. There are people who, for instance, did not like, sympathized but not liked the Occupy movement, such as Noam Chomsky. Chomsky is in it. For the philosophers among you, Zizek has been in it, but also lesser known people to the public. But that creates it creates really a movement, and that is fundamentally different from everything that we have had politically now. We know of, well, I know of no political system which from the outset said, okay, we will never ever grab power. We don't want to be in power. If they ask some of our people who are competent, be it engineers or in microeconomics or in whatever, these people are available to may be part of a government. But it is not as such a party. It has. We do not work to the next election, but we want to keep the whole. As we said in the beginning, we want to create an area where permanent revolution is possible.
Thank you. It's I mean, like I said, I'm still learning about Deem 25. I should know more about it. So this is obviously quite different from what Arendt means by the councils in a couple ways. It's larger. It's based on a manifesto. It's not based on a simply geographic location. It's much more a group of like-minded people joining a movement, as you've described it, but one that's
on an ad hoc basis. If the problem we want to attack is a local one, it will be a local group that starts.
Okay, so it's sort of local. It's local or not local movements designed to attack or to address particular issues, but not seeking power, but simply to have some influence. I take it.
Yes, influence the democratic volume or of for the moment existing structures.
Okay. Yeah.
It may be that we want to one day to well, definitely we want to change the European Union. DM means Democracy in Europe Movement 25. By 25, we want to change the system as it exists now.
Yeah. So it's a political movement. In that way, it's somewhat like Occupy, but with different structure, and it's something like the Tea Party, again, which doesn't have a political party, unless you say they're the Republicans. But I mean, it's a publicly oriented movement that's trying to motivate people for some political and social ends. No.
Motivate and actively participate.
Yes, I mean, I think these are not the councils as she imagines them, but they're more like non-profit or or civic groups, at least as they're imagined here. And I think, this is these are not the councils as she imagines them, but they're more like non-profit or non-profit or civic groups, at least as they're imagined here. And I think, civic groups, at least as they're imagined here. And I think, this is these are not the councils as she imagines them, but they're more like non-profit or non-profit or civic groups, at least as they're imagined here. in this case, organized around a manifesto.
Yeah. It would not have the permanent status of a council, as Arendt said, but it can have that for a certain amount of time. If we say, okay, the infrastructure here of our community is bad, how do we tackle it? Then we start motivating people, trying to bring in people who know how to handle these problems, not just sitting around the table and say, well, we don't want to tax each other, and so we go to the state or to the federal level, but then we have to follow their rules. No. The idea of the M is the local community will decide and will do the follow-up.
Roger, your microphone is muted.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for letting me know, Daphne. There's a lot of great ideas in the Deem 25 movement, and I want to thank Jan. It's something I've been meaning to learn more about, so I will continue to do so. As we're moving towards the end of the discussion and the end of this discussion about this book, I just wanted to maybe recap a few points as we move forward. One of the questions is really, is this book about revolution? Is there a book about a theory of revolution? And so some people say it provides a blueprint for how to have a successful revolution. Follow the Americans, not the French. You can read it that way. I don't think that's what Arendt meant. I think she's really interested in the question of freedom. Is it possible today to found freedom in a meaningful way that can last in the modern world? And there's a lot of different aspects to that question, but in the end, it comes down to this: can we mobilize people to act in concert with others powerfully to engage in public spirited discussions and debates about how to live together? And that's the question that she's really engaged in. We have very much, whether in Europe or the United States, lost that public engagement. People get very involved on an issue. They get involved in a protest. But what does it mean to actually talk with others, those you disagree with, and engage in the political activity of trying to come to some sort of compromise, consensus agreement? That's the hard work of politics, and that's what Arendt thinks that a free people does. And this book is about how one today could found such a free world, a free people. And it has to happen through revolution, but it has to happen through a revolution that focuses on freedom, not on meeting necessities. And that is an unlikely event, according to her. And that's where she leaves us, sadly. Are there any final thoughts? I mean, we're almost out of time. I see Melissa has written something at the end. Let me see. That Brisbane had an open university. The Manus Islands refugees are now doing the same thing. Refugees are leaning on happiness, saying you cannot take our happiness. Okay, good. And there's a comment by Suzanne Ouellette. from our Google Plus community group, inspired by Hannah Arendt's work, I jumped into local politics there. In our little town of about 2,500 people, I worked to support a Democratic state of candidates for town supervisor. People came out to vote on November 7th, and one of our candidates won. After 3 recounting of absentee ballots, it appears our candidate for town supervisor has won by 1 vote. She is a concerned, gifted woman with teachers and rights. She attended the recent Arendt conference, and an inspiring, passionate speech describes how it prepared her for the town supervisor job. Let's hope the most recent vote count holds. I'm sending her a copy of this chapter we just finished. Well, that's great, Suzanne. Thanks so much. What?
Roger,
that was Derek. That was Derek Cloud, actually. So she's a friend and someone we've known for a long time. Yes, Pat?
Roger, you have access to the future with your students, and do you see a recognition by them about the importance of maintaining this system? Or I'm the product of a poor immigrant family, so I've always grown up understanding the importance of it. Do you see it in the students? I know that lots of them are aware of this. I'm up there once. But do you really see it the way, or do you have a positive attitude about the future?
Yeah, always, Pat. I mean, I think that's the beauty of students. They're young and they're not cynical. I mean, you're supposed to be idealistic when you're young, and they are. They have to be taught the way the world is, and then they have to figure out how they want to change it. My job is not to tell them how to change it. It's to try and teach them how it is. There's a lot of criticisms of students going on around the country right now around free speech and other things. And I don't really like to talk about that with students because I don't think it's the students' fault. I think it's the fault of other faculty and administrators who are in many cases fanning the flames of this attack on public discussions and engagement, and the students are reacting to that. But even if the students are engaging in this and are trying to shut down speech, I find that's what students should do. They should be young and idealistic and take chances. And I would much rather have a student who does that and is willing to talk to me and learn and engage, even if we fundamentally disagree, than a student who's bored and doesn't engage publicly. So I think we have to be very careful about some of this rhetoric, anti-student rhetoric that we're hearing around the country that I think is not right and not fair. Young people are supposed to take chances and do things. And what I will tell you this, Pat, is the young people are upset. They're angry. They feel the country has largely gotten away from them. And they really want it to change. I don't think they know yet, per se, how, but they really want something to happen. And I think that's a good thing. And that kind of engagement, which I see by young people, will, I'm confident, at some point bear fruit. I don't know where it will go. It's not my job to say. My job is really not to tell them how. It's simply to teach them what's going on now and let them figure out how to change it. And that's how I see the job of a teacher. So I'm going to leave it at that. We're going to end our discussion on Revolution. I think it's a great book. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to take a little time off through the new year, and we're actually going to come back in later January and do a series of essays. Samantha Hill, who some of you have seen do some of our talks, who's the assistant director of the center, is going to lead 3 of our reading groups in January and February because I'm going to be out of touch and out of the country doing some work. I'll try and join in if I can, but I'm not going to be reliable. And then starting in March, we're going to start reading together a new book that just came out of Hannah Arendt's essays, unpublished essays, called, I think it's called Thinking Without Banisters. And it's edited by Jerome Cohn, and it's got about 40 new essays in it that have never been published. It's going to take a while to get through, but I haven't read it. I'm very excited to do so. So that will start in March. So I hope we'll see you in January and February, and if not, till March. But have a very happy New Year to you all. I think Sam is giving you some of the dates, or the Hannah Arendt Center is giving you some of the dates. It's all available on our website also if you want to look at it. But on January 26th, we're going to read We Refugees. February 9th, Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship. And February 23rd, Thinking and Moral Considerations. And Sam will lead those. And then after that, we'll jump into this new book on Arendt's unpublished essays. Have a very happy and healthy and joyful New Year to you all. And I hope to see you in 2018. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Roger. It's been
Thank
a
you,
privilege.
Roger.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Roger.
Thanks, Roger.
Roger, have a great holiday.